Vessel-Commander Ashenul had done this 141 times, and it had worked 141 times, and so when the choir's flagship dropped out of fold space above the colony world Meridian, he expected the usual quiet unraveling to begin within the hour. The keening did not fail. That was simply a fact about the universe, the way gravity was a fact, the way the choir's 1,000 linked voices were a fact. You broadcast the resonance into a population's collective mind, and the resonance found every private grief, every buried fear, every small daily disappointment a species had learned to carry without naming, and it amplified those things until the weight of carrying them became unbearable. Societies did not fight wars against despair. They simply stopped. Ashenul had watched it happen to proud species and frightened ones, to species with fleets and species with none. The math was old and it was reliable. Meridian was a modest target, a domed mining and research colony of perhaps 90,000 people clinging to the shelf of a moon with no weather to speak of and no fleet at all. The choir's long-range listening arrays had logged the colony for 6 years. Agricultural output, radio chatter, the ordinary hum of a small human settlement doing small human things. Nothing about it suggested anything but an easy morning's work. Cohesion index at baseline, reported Thress, the ship's second voice, from the resonance table. Thress spoke in the layered chord that all choir used when addressing someone outside the hive link, 3 overlapping tones collapsing into approximate standard. Baseline is 71.4. Historical median for a colony this size. Begin the broadcast, Ashenul said. He watched the dome on the display, a pale hemisphere against grey rock, lit from within by the small yellow lights of 100,000 ordinary lives. He felt, as he always did in this moment, something almost like tenderness for what he was about to unmake. It was not cruelty. He did not think of himself as cruel. He thought of himself as efficient, and efficiency required that this stop being a place where people lived and start being a place where the choir administered. The keening went out. He watched the cohesion index the way another commander might watch a targeting reticle. 71.4. He waited for the first tremor, the first slow bleed downward that would become, within 4 or 5 hours, a freefall. 71.4. He waited longer. 71.3. Confirm the broadcast is transmitting, he said. Confirmed. Vessel-Commander. Full strength, full spectrum. Every home in the dome is receiving it. 71.4. Something in Ashenul's chest, the small secondary node of his nervous system that the choir's biology kept separate from the hive link, the part of him that was allowed to be afraid without the whole choir feeling it, began, very quietly, to do something he did not have a category for. He did not call it fear yet. He called it, in the privacy of his own single mind, unexpected. Down in the dome, in a low prefabricated building that had once been a schoolroom and was now, most days, a clinic, Naomi Cole was doing inventory on bandages when the broadcast started. She felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before you consciously notice a storm, a pressure behind the eyes, an old grief surfacing for no reason she could name. Her mother's face, gone 11 years now. The particular quality of a silence in a hospital room. She stood very still with a box of gauze in her hands and let it come. "You feel that?" said Priya from the doorway, one of the clinic's 2 other staff, arms folded, watching Naomi with the careful attention of someone checking whether a friend was about to break. "I feel it," Naomi said. "What is it?" "I don't know yet. Something's talking to us. Not with words." She set the box down. "Get everyone to the hall. Now, not in an hour. Now." Word moved through Meridian the way it always moved, in low urgent voices from door to door, and within 20 minutes the colony's central hall, built for town meetings and harvest dances and the twice-yearly election of a council nobody particularly wanted to serve on, was filling with people who had left dinners half-eaten and children half-dressed, all of them carrying some version of the same unnamed weight settling into their chests. Naomi climbed onto the low stage at the front, not because anyone had asked her to, but because someone always had to, and it had been her for 6 years since old Winforth had died and left the job to whoever was standing closest. "Everybody's feeling something," she said, and didn't raise her voice, because raising your voice in this kind of room only spread panic faster. "I don't know what's making us feel it. I don't know if it's coming from up there." She gestured vaguely at the dome's ceiling and the sky beyond it, or from somewhere else. "But I know what we do when the weight gets heavy and we don't know why. We've done it before. We are going to do it again." She looked out at the hall. Faces she'd delivered babies for, faces she'd sat with while husbands and wives died, faces of teenagers who thought they were too old for this and would do it anyway because their parents were doing it. Who wants to start? She asked. An old man near the back, Odo Fenn, who ran the hydroponics bay and had lost his daughter to a reactor fault 9 years back, raised his hand the way he always did, without hesitation, because he had done this more times than almost anyone alive on Meridian. I'll start, he said, and stood, and the hall went quiet in the particular way it always did for this. My name is Odo Fenn. I carry the loss of my daughter, Renna Fenn, who is 22 years old, and I am not carrying it alone tonight. You are not carrying it alone, the hall answered, altogether, the way you'd answer a call in church, except it wasn't church. It wasn't anything with a name Naomi had ever been able to give a visiting anthropologist who'd once asked what to call it. They just called it the standing. Someone else stood. Then someone else. Grief named aloud, one person at a time, met each time by the same unhurried answer from 90,000 throats compressed into the 1,100 who'd made it to the hall in time, and the tens of thousands more doing the same thing in their own kitchens, their own bunkhouses, their own mining shafts, because the standing didn't require the hall. The hall was only where you went if you needed the weight of other bodies in a room. It required only the naming and the answer. Up above, in a ship built by a species that had never lost a war it started, the numbers refused to move. 60-hour projection, Thresh reported. 4 hours into the broadcast. Cohesion index, 70.9. This is within normal noise for a population this size. There is no meaningful decline. Ashenul stood at the viewport with his hands folded behind his back, a posture his hive siblings would have read as calm, and that felt, from the inside, like holding a structure together with will alone. Run a diagnostic on the array, he said. Already run twice. Vessel-Commander. The array is transmitting at full parameter across every registered human neurological receptor band. The broadcast is reaching them. It is reaching all of them. Then why isn't it working? It wasn't a question, not really, and Thresh didn't try to answer it as one. He had run this doctrine on species that fought back with fleets and species that had no fleets at all, on species that believed in an afterlife and species that believed in nothing, and every time, every single time, somewhere in the private architecture of a mind, there was a door the keening could find. A grief unprocessed. A fear unnamed. A small daily weight the species had learned to carry by pretending it wasn't there. The keening did not create despair. It only found what was already buried and asked it, gently, relentlessly, to come to the surface. He pulled the historical record on Meridian.
Nineti to usant humans.
A mining and research settlement, 3 generations old, founded by colonists from a homeworld he had never surveyed and had no reason to survey, since the doctrine had never needed more than a colony's own psychology to work. He found, buried in the settlement's public record, a thing so mundane the analysts hadn't flagged it, because why would they, a municipal ordinance, over 80 years old, establishing something called the standing as a mandatory civic practice during any declared crisis. Attendance not compulsory. Participation, according to the ordinance's own language, expected of anyone who has ever lost anything and wishes to say so aloud. He read the ordinance 3 times. Thresh, he said. Pull every recorded instance of a crisis on this colony in its founding records. Fires, reactor failures, deaths, anything. It took Thresh 11 minutes to compile it, because there was a great deal of it. This was, after all, a mining colony, and mining colonies killed people the way where the kill crops, routinely and without malice. 11 minutes, and a very long list, and at the bottom of every incident report the same phrase repeated, generation after generation, in different clerks' handwriting. A standing was held. Attendance, high. They practice this, Ashenul said slowly, mostly to himself. Whatever this is. They have practiced it for, he checked the founding date, for 81 years. On every death, every failure, every grief they've ever had. He felt the shape of it before he had words for it, the way you feel the shape of a wall in the dark before your hand finds it. The keening did not fail because it hadn't found their grief. It had found all of it, immediately, everywhere, the way it always did. What it hadn't found was a door it could open that these people hadn't already, deliberately, generation after generation, propped wide open themselves. Escalate the broadcast, he said, and heard the tightness in his own layered voice before he'd finished deciding to say it. Full spectrum. Double amplitude. If the doorway is already open, we go through it harder. The second wave hit Meridian at just past midnight, colony time, and it was worse. Naomi felt it as a kind of pressure behind her sternum, a grief that wasn't quite her mother this time but something older and less specific. The accumulated weight of every hard winter, every colonist who'd frozen in a supply run accident, every child buried in the thin rocky soil under the dome because there hadn't been room to ship the dead home. It reached for things she hadn't thought about in years, and it reached for them all at once, and for one long, terrible minute she understood, in her body rather than her mind, exactly how a person could simply stop. She held onto the podium rail and breathed, and around her in the hall she watched 90, then 200, then 400 people go the same kind of pale and still, a wave of something moving through the room like weather. "Stay with me," she said, not loud, but the hall's acoustics had always been kind to a voice that meant it. Whatever that was, it's bigger, and it wants the same thing the first one wanted. It wants you to think you're the only one carrying it. You're not. Odo Fen, who had gone grey in the face and was gripping the back of a chair with both hands, straightened up anyway, the way he always did, and said, in a voice that shook only a little, "My name is Odo Fen. I carry a second thing tonight, which is fear, and I am not carrying it alone." "You are not carrying it alone." One by one, then in twos and threes, the hall answered back, and it wasn't magic, Naomi thought distantly, even as she said her own name into the microphone and named her own fear alongside her old grief. It wasn't magic, and it wasn't a technology, and it wasn't anything the people up there in orbit could take a sensor reading of and understand, because it was just this, 81 years of a community deciding, over and over, on purpose, every single time it hurt, that nobody in this dome was going to carry the worst thing alone. You didn't build that in a night. You built it the way you built topsoil, one thin layer at a time, across generations, until it was simply the ground you stood on. Out past the dome's edge, at Node 7, where the colony's water reclamation plant hummed on through the crisis because water didn't stop being necessary just because the sky was doing something terrible, a young technician named Belansaro stood alone at his post with his own hand shaking, and did the only thing he knew how to do, which was say his name and his fear out loud to an empty maintenance corridor, and imagine, because it worked better if you imagined it, the hall answering him. Back anyway. In the resonance chamber of the choir's flagship, something was going wrong that had never gone wrong before. The choir did not have individual minds in the way the humans below did, or rather, they had individual minds nested inside a shared resonance, a chord that each voice contributed one note to, a structure that had made the choir extraordinarily hard to demoralize, since no single failure of nerve could ever propagate. The chord simply recomposed around the gap. It was, Ashenul had always privately believed, the most stable psychology any species had ever built for itself. It was why the choir had never lost, and never would. It was Kes, the ship's youngest voice, barely out of the collective creche, who first reported the dissonance. Vessel-Commander. Kes's tritonal voice had a wobble in it that Ashenul had never heard from a voice before, an actual crack in the harmonic structure, as though one string in an instrument had gone slightly out of tune with the others and hadn't been corrected. "I'm receiving. I don't have a category for what I'm receiving." "Explain." The amplified broadcast is bouncing. Something down there is answering it. Not resisting it, answering it. Like a chord answering a chord. And it's, Vessel-Commander, it's compatible with our resonance architecture. It's finding the same channels the keening uses to reach them, except it's traveling the other direction. Into us. Ashenul felt the cold precision he prided himself on begin, for the first time in 142 campaigns, to slip. Cut the broadcast. Attempting. Vessel-Commander, Kes's voice cracked fully this time, the three tones falling briefly out of phase with each other in a way that made every other voice on the bridge flinch, because a voice's tones falling out of phase was not a sound the choir's biology was built to make, or hear, without alarm. "I keep hearing it. My name is Odo Fen. You are not carrying it alone. It doesn't stop when the broadcast stops. It's, Vessel-Commander, it's already in the chord." Silence him, snap Thress, an order Ashenul had never in his career heard given on his own bridge, because you did not silence a voice was never silenced, a voice was folded back into the chord if it faltered, gently, automatically, the way a body reabsorbed a dying cell. But Kes's falter wasn't the kind the fold back was built for. It was individuating. Kes was, in the privacy of his own collapsing resonance, beginning, for the first time in the history of any choir vessel Ashenul had commanded, to have a thought that was only his. "I don't want to carry it alone either," Kes said, very quietly, in a voice that had stopped being three tones and had become, for one terrible moment, one. Ashenul watched the ship's technicians move to fold Kes back into the collective harmonic, watched the young voice's individual note dissolve back into the chord with a shudder that rippled visibly across the resonance table's readouts, a spike, then a slow, uneasy settling, the whole ship's harmonic architecture bruised in a way it had never been bruised before. Full cohesion index, Ashenul said, and his own voice had gone very quiet. Ship-wide. Now. The number that came back was not 71.4, or anything close to it. It was the choir's own number, the one they never had to check because it had never in living memory needed checking, and it had dropped 4 full points in under an hour. The choir had spent its entire existence weaponizing the collapse of other species' collective minds. It had never once considered, because it had never once needed to consider, what it would feel like to have that door opened in the other direction. Explain to me, Ashenul said, standing very still in the center of the bridge, what I am looking at. Thress did not answer immediately, which was itself an answer. The doctrine assumes an asymmetry, Vessel-Commander, Thress said finally. We broadcast dissonance into a target population and their collective psychology destabilizes because their grief is private, isolated, each mind carrying its own weight alone even inside a crowd. That asymmetry is what makes the doctrine safe for us to use. We reach into them. They cannot reach into us, because they have no shared resonance architecture to reach with. And this colony, Thress said, has spent 81 years deliberately building something that behaves, functionally, like a resonance architecture. Not biological. Cultural. A practiced, repeated, communal act of externalizing private grief into a shared structure, over and over, until the structure became strong enough to carry weight the way our own cord carries weight. A long pause. Vessel-Commander, when we broadcast into them, we didn't find isolated minds with private doors. We found something that behaves like a choir, and it answered us back in the same register we used to reach it. Ashenul thought of Kess's voice cracking into a single unbearable note. I don't want to carry it alone either. How many more voices will destabilize if we continue the broadcast? I don't know, Vessel-Commander. We have never measured this before because it has never happened before. I would estimate, Thress hesitated in a way Ashenul had genuinely never heard from him, that it will not stop at 1. Ashenul looked at the display, at the pale dome on the moon below, lit now not with the ordinary yellow of 90,000 small lives but with something else, thermal blooms gathering at what his tactical overlay identified as 41 separate points across the colony, clusters of bodies that his sensors, cross-referencing the ordnance he'd read 4 hours ago, now correctly labeled, standing sites. Active. They knew, he said slowly. Not that we were coming specifically. But they built this not knowing who or when. The way you build a ravine not knowing which flood will come, only that one will. Vessel-Commander, said Rear Voice Preth, from the command chair at the edge of the bridge, careful, the way Ashenul remembered being careful with a superior officer decades ago before this posting had made him the one being careful with. Recommend immediate cessation of broadcast and full withdrawal to fold safe distance. Continued operation risks cascading instability across the entire choir aboard this vessel, and I have no confidence the effect will not propagate to the fleet. Ashenul did not answer immediately. He was thinking of Kess, of the single note the young voice's individual grief had made before the fold-back swallowed it, and of how that single note had sounded, for half a second, less like a malfunction and more like the most honest thing he had heard in 142 campaigns. Cease the broadcast, he said. The silence that followed, up on the bridge, was not the silence of victory. Kess sat at the resonance table with the rest of the voices, folded back into the chord, indistinguishable now from any other note in the harmonic, except that Ashenul, watching the readouts, could see the faint persistent tremor still running through the ship's collective resonance, a bruise the fold back hadn't quite healed. It would heal, probably, given time and distance. But it had happened. It was, in the choir's 141 campaign history, a thing that had never happened, and now it had, and no diagnostic could make that untrue. Open a channel to the surface, Ashenul said. Whoever speaks for them. It took Meridian's communications team almost 20 minutes to route the request through equipment that had never in 81 years been asked to talk to an alien warship, and in that 20 minutes, Naomi Cole walked from the hall, where the standing had, at some point in the last hour, without anyone announcing it, quietly become something closer to ordinary conversation, people passing water and blankets, the terrible pressure in the room easing the way weather eases, to the small communications shack at the colony's edge, still in the same clothes she'd been wearing when the first broadcast hit, hands not quite steady. The face that resolved on the shack's cracked old monitor was nothing like a human face, grey-toned, elongated, an expression built around features that didn't map cleanly to anything she recognized as an expression at all, and the voice that came through, when it came, was layered, 3 tones trying and mostly failing to collapse into something a human throat could have made. "You are the one who spoke first," the voice said. The translation lagged half a second behind the sound and rendered a strange, careful formality. "In the hall. At the start." "I'm one of the ones who speaks first," Naomi said. "It's not always me. It's whoever's closest to the front." Something in the alien's posture shifted, and even through a language she couldn't parse and a face she couldn't read, she understood she'd just answered a question he hadn't quite known how to ask. "You do not have a single leader for this." "No," she said. "We have people who take turns standing up." "We came here," Ashenul said, "to end this colony's ability to resist us. That has been the purpose of every campaign I have commanded for 142 engagements, and it has never once failed." "It sounds like you're telling me it failed," Naomi said. "I am telling you," he said, and something in the layered voice thinned, unspooled almost to a single note before catching itself, "that it did something I do not have a category for. We broadcast into your minds expecting to find each of you carrying your grief alone, the way every species we have encountered carries it. We found instead something that answered us the way one of my own voices answers another. Do you understand what that means for a species like mine?" Naomi thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about most things. "I think it means we scared you," she said. "Not with a weapon. Just by being," she searched for the word, "by being together in a way you didn't expect." "One of my crew individuated," Ashenul said, and it was clear from the strange rawness in his tone that he had not meant to say this, that it was coming out of him the way Kess's single note had come out, unplanned. "For the first time in the history of my choir. He said he did not want to carry something alone. That is not a sentence a voice is capable of forming. And yet he formed it, because your colonies," he paused, visibly searching, the translation system flagging the gap, "your colony's practice reached into the same architecture we use to reach into others, and it worked in both directions." "The standing," Naomi said quietly. "That's what we call it. It's not a weapon. We didn't build it for you or for anyone like you. We built it because Meridian's a hard place to live, and people die here more than they should, and 81 years ago somebody decided that if this colony was going to survive its own bad winters, nobody could be allowed to carry the worst of it by themselves. That's all it ever was. A way to get through Tuesdays." Ashenul was quiet for a long moment. "A way to get through Tuesdays," he repeated, and something about the phrase, filtered through translation into his own layered tones, seemed to land somewhere he hadn't expected. "You built a structure that can, apparently, unmake a warship's collective mind, as a way to get through ordinary days." "We didn't know it could do that," Naomi said. "Honestly, we still don't fully understand what just happened up there. We just know what happens down here. When somebody's hurting, we don't let them hurt by themselves. That's the whole thing. There's no more to it than that." "There is a great deal more to it than that," Ashenul said. "I simply do not think you can see it from the inside." He gave the order to withdraw 40 minutes later, and it was not, whatever Rear Voice Prether's tactical log would eventually record it as, a retreat born of fear for the fleet's safety alone. Ashenul had commanded through worse odds. He had lost ships before and held formation through it. This was something else, and he suspected, though he did not say this to Preth, or to Thress, or to anyone but the small unlinked node of himself that the hive link never fully touched, that no amount of remaining in orbit would change the outcome, because the thing that had broken open on his bridge tonight was not a tactical problem the fleet could outmaneuver. It was a door. Once opened, it did not close simply because you left the room. "I will file a full report to Choir Command," he told Naomi, in their last exchange before the fold drive spun up. "I do not know how to categorize what happened here. I do not know if my superiors will believe it, or if they will believe it and decide it means Meridian must be destroyed rather than left as it is, precisely because of what it does to a mind like mine." "That's not really something I can help you with," Naomi said, and there was no cruelty in it, only a tired honesty. "But I can tell you the only thing I know for certain. Whatever you tell them, it's already true, whether you tell them or not. We are not going to stop doing this. Not because it's a strategy. Because it's how 90,000 people manage to keep living somewhere that tries pretty hard, most winters, to kill them." Ashenul looked at her for a long moment through the cracked old monitor, this ordinary woman in a colony clinic spare uniform, standing in front of a communications rig that had never been designed to speak to anything beyond its own moon. "I have subjugated 41 worlds," he said, and it came out flatter than he intended, more like a confession than a boast. I have never once encountered a species that prepared for something like me not by becoming stronger than me, but by becoming. He stopped, and this time the pause was not a translation lag, it was him, choosing, carefully, a word he did not often need. Kinder to each other. On purpose. Every day, for generations, before there was any reason to think it would matter against anyone like us. It mattered before you ever showed up, Naomi said. That's kind of the point. We weren't building it for you. The channel closed. The fleet withdrew in careful formation, the way had arrived, and within the hour the pale dome of Meridian sat under an empty sky again, ordinary, small, unremarkable to any passing sensor sweep, the same as it had looked for 81 years, the same as it would look tomorrow. In the hall, the standing had, by the time the all-clear reached them from the communications shack, mostly dissolved into the ordinary business of a colony putting itself back to bed, blankets folded, children carried home half asleep, the low murmur of relief that never announced itself as relief, just as people talking a little more easily than they had an hour before. Naomi found Odo fend by the door, still there, the way he always was until the last person had gone. They're gone? He asked. They're gone, she said. For now, I think. Maybe for good. I don't actually know. Doesn't much matter tonight, Odo said, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it, an old man's practicality that had buried a daughter and kept showing up anyway. Tonight we did the thing we do. Tomorrow we'll do it again if we have to. She thought, walking home under Meridian's thin artificial dawn, about the alien commander's strange grey face and his stranger admission. I do not know how to categorize what happened here, and she thought that she didn't fully understand it either, not the mechanics of it, not whatever had actually reached up through 100 kilometers of vacuum and touched something in a warship's crew. She only understood the part she'd always understood, the part that had nothing to do with warships at all, that grief carried alone got heavier every year, and grief carried together, spoken aloud, and answered, somehow didn't, and that this was true whether or not anyone was ever watching, whether or not it was ever useful for anything beyond simply getting a hard colony through another hard year. 70 kilometers above her, in a report that would take 4 months to reach Choir High Command and generate, upon arrival, a silence in its highest officers that no one there yet had language to describe, Vessel-Commander Ashenul wrote, in his own hand, departing for one paragraph from the detached formal register his superiors expected of him. The colony at Meridian presented no weapon, no fleet, and no technology that our doctrine had not accounted for 100 times before. What it presented instead was a practiced, ordinary, unglamorous discipline of shared grief, built across generations for reasons that had nothing to do with us, that nonetheless reached into the architecture of a choir mind and did something no target has ever done to us before. I do not know how to quantify this. I do not know whether it can be defended against, or whether defended against is even the correct frame for a thing that was never built as a weapon. I know only that for the length of one broadcast, my own crew felt, for the first time in our long history, what it is to carry something alone, and one of them, for a single unbearable moment, did not want to anymore. I do not believe that feeling, once known, can be made to disappear from a choir simply because we left the system. That uncertainty, I believe, is the only honest thing I can report. By the time that report was read in full, copies of it had already reached 73 parties choir command had not intended to share it with. An old pattern, some careful analyst would later note, that no one had quite managed to stop happening whenever choir fleets returned from worlds they hadn't expected to leave changed. And in quiet rooms across a galaxy that measured its safety by what it could threaten and what it could withstand, beings who had spent long careers learning what other species were capable of found themselves sitting with a single strange paragraph about an ordinary colony and a discipline of shared grief, and feeling, without quite being able to say why, that something about the shape of power in the galaxy had shifted, not because Meridian was strong, but because it had shown, almost by accident, that the oldest doctrine any conqueror had ever relied on assumed that the people it broke would always be alone in the breaking. Meridian had simply never agreed to be.